Starting the recording now. Well, welcome back, everybody. I know we're going to be one or two shy tonight. I had some regrets from Ron Klusmeyer, as well as and sort of tentative on possibly one or two others. But so I think we've got enough to get started for tonight. But I am recording it for anybody who isn't able to be here tonight. I know that there are some people who are following along, just watching the videos. I do try to get them up in a timely manner, although this past week I didn't get it up till Sunday, so my bad. Before we get started, I will apologize ahead of time for the quality of my voice. Like right now, it's okay, but it may deteriorate quickly. My son brought home something from school, and I am now the beneficiary of it. And so, I mean, he's still running a fever. We've still had to keep him home for the past 2 days. Might even have to do it tomorrow. We'll have to see how he is. But I've largely been working from home. Although right now I am in the office at the church, sort of all by my lonesome and behind locked doors. So, but let's get started.
Okay.
Gracious and most holy God, we continue to work our way through exploring the last book of the Bible, one that we find difficult to understand. We're hoping that the foundations that we've laid can now, as we step into the first couple chapters, that we might get a better sense of what John of Patmos was writing, and the culture and the background that he was writing to, and that we might learn something new. So be with us tonight, we pray. Be with us in our learning and in your presence with us. So we ask this in the name of the one who was and is to come. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so welcome, and just have to make sure that I have the correct correct show up, and I also have to readjust my window size because it's actually not being as cooperative as I thought it would be. There we go, I think. Sorry, I'm trying to resize the window so I can see it. And all right, so just as a bit of a recap, just with where we have been, and of course, the one thing about working through Revelation is that we've done a fairly lengthy introduction in terms of we've essentially, the past 2 sessions have been introduction, and tonight is the first night that we actually get to dive into some of the individual chapters. So it's not absolutely required, but if you have a copy of a Bible in front of you and you can turn to Revelation, we will be going through it, not necessarily line by line, but my usual guideline, as always, is that there's never a bad time to ask a question. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and so we're going to be going through that. And if there's things that you're kind of wondering about as we pick them up, I will do my best to try and address it, but keeping in mind the background that we've done, talking about symbols, is that sometimes symbols do have open-ended meanings. I mean, I can give you sort of some general things about certain symbols, but at the same time, I don't want to necessarily limit the artistry that John of Patmos was working with here. So today we are moving on to the 7 letters to the 7 letters to 7 churches, and that's today. Next week I am on study leave, so we are going to be taking a break, and then we pick it back up into the groups of 7, to borrow Canadian metaphor, specifically looking at the symbols of the scrolls, the trumpets, and the bowls. even though the scrolls and the trumpets kind of happen together, then there's this interlude, and then we get into the bowls. We deal with the interlude in week 5, and this is the core message of this. And it's the pulling back of the curtain, and that's on November 29th. And then we move to what ultimately Revelation is moving us towards is it's the undercurrent for everything that's in this book, even in the stuff that's really, really weird and lurid. And it's that hope amidst darkness. And then, pardon me, the last. And then, of course, the last session is on December 13th. And I've actually titled that Reclaiming Revelation. The entire thesis of this course is to say specifically, as people who are part of a mainline liberal denomination, how do we claim or reclaim revelation for ourselves? In some respects, we already do it because of singing. Singing it. Now, David, I see your hand up.
Yes, I raised my hand because the date there for week 7 seems to be.
Oh, it says November.
December.
Yeah, that should say December.
Yeah.
November 13th is this Sunday. My bad.
Mm-hmm.
So just ignore the November. And as not so much this session, but in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about how Revelation understands time, the concept of time. And so I can make a bit of a joke then about this date being wrong. But it is, but at the same time, that is December 13th, not November 13th, my bad. All right. So a couple things from last week, and I'm going to pull in something as a little reminder to myself of something that I remembered partway through, of a really good example of modern apocalyptic literature that is actually, I'm one generation too young to know. And so I'm gonna bring with that. So the language of Revelation is pictorial as opposed to propositional. The trouble is, most of the time we speak to each other in what is called propositional language. In other words, what we say is what we mean, or at least, and it generally is. It's intended to be logical, sequential, easy to follow, and has very specific definitions around what it means. Whereas symbols are used literally. For example, the symbol pi means is a symbol that is the mathematical relationship between the circumference of a circle and its diameter. And we just use that symbol because no one has time to write out all the repeating like the digits of pi, because it doesn't. There's no repetition to it. It's also logical language, and what diachronic means that stuff happens in a linear way. Oddly enough, one of the things about this course is I'm actually trying to provide you an understanding of Revelation by using propositional language to explain what is pictorial language, and just trying to kind of, what I'm really trying to do is to get you to think in more pictorial language. But the only way to approach it really is to start from this point and move in, because Revelation is pictorial, and the symbols that are presented, the images that are presented, are meant to go beyond that. Last week we talked about Babylon as just one of those symbols, and I think we went through several different slides explaining just why the symbol Babylon is used. Now, we could do that kind of in-depth with every single symbol that appears in Revelation, and we would be here for a very long time. But the idea is that these symbols are intended to be evocative. They're intended to trigger emotional responses, not logical thinking ones. So Revelation is something you listen to in many respects with your heart, but at the same time, the people who heard it for the first time would know exactly what these symbols meant. You know, and with, for example, the American midterm elections, you know, images of donkeys and elephants fighting right now seems to be rather appropriate, but that's an example of symbolic language. Also, time. Richard, you're gonna like this, but really in this kind of language, it's a wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. So. And I just saw Richard laugh because he knows exactly where that's from. So, but the idea is that you have events that are layered. Things do not happen in you know, it isn't this, then this, then this. Even though in the process of writing, inevitably there is stuff that's in front of the other stuff. The concept of time is much more layered and synchronic, and things are happening at the same time. We get to see that more next in the next session, as I alluded to before. And not only that, it uses the symbols of myth as transmitting truth. And of course, there's what we had is that, you know, just the comparison as with last week. Just saying that, think of propositional language that we are familiar with is like looking at a painting by Robert Bateman. On the other hand, pictorial language is more like abstract, and that's, you know, we have Picasso, Barnett Newman's Voice of Fire. And the other thing is that the symbols themselves there's a lot of nuances to them. They're not just like, does everybody know what an allegory is?
Yeah.
You know, generally an allegory is something that uses images and languages that directly represent one thing. Like quite often we interpret the parables as being allegories. The reality is they're not. They actually are intended to be evocative in their own right. We tend to read them as allegories. But like, for example, C.S. Lewis's Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is largely an allegory with regard to the Christian story. It is like Aslan is an allegory for Jesus, specific, and he intended it that way. Whereas the symbols in Revelation are much more broad in that sense. They're intended to evoke not just one thing, but several different things. And similarly, the numbers are in and themselves symbolic, and also John of Patmos was definitely educated in Greek mathematics and by definition numerology. That the numbers themselves are symbolic, but he also believed that they actually had power in and of themselves, and so they function as adjectives. So when you have a certain number of things, it is symbolic of something broader. And we'll, you know, 7 letters to 7 churches. We're going to get into that, for example. The other thing is, and that the really obscure part is that the actual use of the language itself, the construction of the syllables, at the very end of Revelation, John of Patmos writes that he wanted to make sure that the language in Revelation was transmitted accurately. If you're going to copy this, copy it word for word. Do not alter it or make comments or margin notes or anything else like this. Which, you know, funnily enough, particularly fundamentalist Christians actually have taken that to mean the entirety of the Bible before it. John of Patmos only meant for this that statement for this particular work. That you know that the crafting of it was very important to it. So the medium is the message. Now here's the one that I realized that I didn't bring up before, because I'm actually one generation too young for this one. And I was going to sing it, try and sing it to you, but I'm not trusting my singing voice. But if you're familiar with "Bye Bye Miss American Pie, Drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. You know that one. That American Pie is a modern apocalyptic poem. Happens to be set to music,
From McLean.
but because there are symbols throughout it. Like, for example, the jester is an allegory for John Lennon, but more broadly speak, like some of it's allegory and some of it is more symbolic. And then you have all of these different figures present in this poem about where the state of rock and roll as an art form was in the aftermath of the death of Buddy Holly. And so, but of course, he never once says Buddy Holly in it. He never says John Lennon. He never mentions Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones. When he does mention a Rolling Stone, it's, you know, he's actually saying something about Bob Dylan. But the symbols are there. But I'm actually a generation too young for that one. So it would have gone, a lot of those would have gone like right over my head. David.
Well, the other wonderful song that he did was Vincent, about Vincent van Gogh.
Yeah. No, and you know, this kind of language with that Don McLean was using is probably one of the closest equivalents that you might understand. But like I said, this one didn't occur to me until I suddenly. I can't remember what it was, but it just came up between last session and this session. It's kind of like, you know, if in all the time that I've done this seminar, I've never brought that one up, and I should have. Just because there. And if you look up the lyrics, they're, you know, it's a long poem. So anyway, so there we go. 7 letters to 7 churches. Now, unfortunately, I've got this. Sometimes I try not to go into theologies, but the 7 letters to 7 churches, where the immanent and the transcendent cross. Now but the definition between the two is the idea is that. What you actually have is there's the symbolic nature of it at a more cosmic scale, also coming into contact into some real life circumstances. That's what it means. Immanent means present with us. The word Emmanuel, God with us, you know, is that immanence. That presence in the moment, whereas the transcendent is beyond, is the cosmos beyond. And so what we have here in these 7 letters is you actually have this intersection point right at the beginning that's intended to draw us into the symbolic world, I guess, if you want to call it that, of Revelation. But it starts by doing so in something that is actually grounded in what people would know. I mean, they would know the symbols in Revelation, but the idea is like, let's kind of take a journey, and this is how he starts it. So, and they may be dealing with real life circumstances, but they may not be. And it's one of these things where we're not entirely sure, right? But some of those are hinted at it. So the one thing to note is that all the 7 churches are physical, real life locations. And I'm going to pull out a map in just a moment. Okay, so we get to do some traveling thanks to the wonders of Google Earth. So I'm going to do that in a moment. And the idea is that the order that the letters appear, if you actually look at the map, which we're going to do, is that it's actually, the letters appear, there's actually an actual sequence to it. And so therefore, what we do know is that it is rooted in real life geography, and it's clear that John of Patmos was familiar with what the geography was. It wasn't just random. You know, there's a certain reason why these churches are presented in this kind of sequence. So one of the things that all 7 churches are located in the Roman province of Asia Minor, what is now modern-day Turkey. The map is still coming, and so this will make a lot more sense when we get there, because I'm going to show this to you. That one of the things, Asia Minor benefited quite well from Roman rule, and things like, for example, Pergamum, one of the cities along that route, was considered to be a regional government seat. So also you had in this particular area, it was largely the after effects of Alexander the Great. That's what Hellenism means: Greek culture being carried to the world. And that was largely the mission of Alexander the Great. 400 years before, established several successor empires that were all Greek speaking. And even when the Romans more or less supplanted a lot of these empires as they built their own empires out, everywhere east of Italy, they didn't speak Latin; they spoke Greek. In fact, I've said this. I think I've said this before. Mel Gibson put out a film, the Passion of the Christ, where you have the Jesus speaking Aramaic to other people, and the Romans speaking Latin. And at one point, Jesus speaks Latin is speaking Latin to the Romans. The reality is that wouldn't be true. What they would be speaking in this area, they would all be speaking Greek, because Greek was a more widespread language than Latin. And so that influence of what is called Hellenism, of Greek culture. I mean, the Romans simply co-opted Hellenism themselves. So, I mean, yes, there's Roman elements. Yes, they largely spoke Latin in the West, but anywhere east, certainly in this area, it was Greek. They spoke Greek, and there is some Persian elements in there from the Persian invasions. That would have happened prior to the rise of the somewhere in around the time of the relationship with the Persian Empire. There were some Persian theology in there. Like, for example, how many of you have heard of Zoroastrianism?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Any of my students.
Yeah, and Zoroastrianism is a dualistic faith tradition that believes in a good God and a bad God. You know, this is a gross oversimplification, and that Zoroastrian influence is actually quite strong. I mean, it influences Christianity today, because what it did is it effectively, that influence elevated Satan from being an accuser to a straight up adversary of God. And in Zoroastrianism, they're effectively equals, whereas Christianity has struggled with that. But that originated in Zoroastrianism. So those influences are there. So it's something for us to pay attention to. And as I've emphasized before, Christianity was such a tiny minority, like not even a census blip at this point in time. And certainly across the Roman Empire. I mean, This was the area with probably one of the largest concentrations of Christian. They were still in a very minor, very small position. So now I need to to make this work. I have to stop the share, and then I got to share something. I got to share something else again, but this time it is Google Earth, and I need to make this a little smaller so I can actually see what I'm doing here. Okay, I gotta. Pardon me while I do some window resizing. That's okay. So can everybody see that? Do you know where that is?
Yep. It's our church.
Yep, that's where I am now. I'm right about
There.
here. However, fortunately, I pre-programmed this, and we're taking a little bit of a trip all the way out across the globe and down into the all of these. So what we have here is, this is the island of Patmos. So I'm just going to zoom in specifically on the island of Patmos. So this is where let's see, I can probably make this a little bit larger here. There we go. And so this is where it is thought that John of Patmos wrote some, if not all, of Revelation, because like he specifically, if where we have here that yeah,
Did they still speak Greek there?
oh yeah, Patmos, curiously enough, unless it's actually on the continent, most of the islands, even off the coast of Turkey, most of them are actually part of Greece.
Oh.
Like Patmos, even though you can pretty much see Turkey from there, it's a Greek island. Now, as soon as you hit the mainland, it is Turkey. So we have, and notice here, we have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And that's the actual sequence of where the letters actually show up. And the cool thing about each of these points is that if you actually zoom in, I was able to drop these pins right on top of the actual ruins of each of these Greco-Roman cities. So we have Ephesus here. There's a theater there. There's still a lot, buried there. I mean, it's an archaeological site. And similarly, we pop up and we go to Smyrna.
Oh, it really is quite far.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, these like this isn't just kind of like down the road. I mean, these are good 1-2 day walking at least from each other. So there's Smyrna, and then Pergamum, which was considered to be a capital, and you can actually see a lot more of the structure there. Notice a lot of them have these theaters as part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we head to Thyatira. And curiously enough, if you pay attention to this is down, what you have is from Ephesus, you're going up the coast, and then once you come to Thyatira, you're actually coming back down a valley. And then Sardis, see, you're traveling along a valley here to Sardis. And again, there's the ruins. Philadelphia, where the city in Pennsylvania gets its name from, and a lot of this is it's overgrown, but there's a ruin underneath this mound. Then Laodicea, being the final one on on the journey. And again, you can see, and this is quite an extensive room. If you can see, it's actually quite large. There's an amphitheater there, and a whole lot of things. But I mean, it's certainly well preserved. So let me just, I'm going to zoom back out. But what you can see here, so there's Patmos. I'm just going to pull Patmos kind of off the list and hide this. But the idea is that these that you can. It's thought that this was kind of a route, because quite often when you would travel from one place to the other, you would be traveling from Ephesus to Smyrna to Pergamum, and then back down this valley here to Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. But here's the interesting thing: none of these mentioned churches, you know, these churches in these cities, are any of the churches that appear in the letters of Paul, with one exception, and that's Ephesus. But that has more to do with Paul worked out of Ephesus, and for the most part. And so you actually there is an actual logical sequence that clearly John of Patmos knew his geography. So anyway, I'm going to stop that share and bring the PowerPoint back up. All right, we're back into here. So let's look at a bit of the historical setting, particularly in this area. At this point in time, roughly around the time of the writing of Revelation, specifically between 90 and 95, it's been 20 years since the end of the First Jewish-Roman War. It's been quite some time since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The war in the First Jewish-Roman War ended in 74 with the infamous siege of Masada. But the temple had been destroyed long before then. But at the same time, there's still, just because it was called the First Jewish-Roman War for a good reason, because there was still, I mean, the Romans came down on the Judean province very hard, basically destroying the temple. It changed the face of both Judaism and Christianity, the First Jewish-Roman War. I mean, I made a video saying it's the most important historical event you've never heard of. But though the trouble was still there, because there would be two more rebellions, and the Kitos War, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt. And in the Bar Kokhba revolt, there was the Emperor Hadrian basically came down like a hammer, and anybody who anybody Jewish was removed from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself was renamed to something else for many years. That's how that was a pretty final. But in that, the temple itself was never rebuilt. Rome always responded brutally with that. At one point, they had been quite tolerant. But the thing is, ever since really the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids, the predecessors to the Romans, there was always this resistance to external power. I mean, which has been, really it's been there for a long time. But politically, Israel had largely been a client state. But people remembered the success and the period of time when Israel was free of imperial rule, and there was always that want to go back to it. Now Rome, but the thing is, Rome itself was in political turmoil. You would have just this rapid succession of emperors. For those people who know Roman history better than I do, and you would have some emperors who were good, some and some were just terrible. And in fact, there was a civil war in Rome during the First Jewish-Roman War. Vespasian, who was actually sent to put down the rebellion, eventually had to go back to Rome, to deal with the civil war, and he ended up as emperor himself. So there was always this constant battle for that top office, and so persecutions was a way of cementing power. Assassinations were a way of eliminating competition. That was just part of the landscape. That once you got into a place of power, you use that power to subjugate and put down your political opponents. There was no such thing as a peaceful transfer of power. And so, for example, between Nero and Vespasian, there were 3 other people declared as emperor within the same year. And then Vespasian managed to establish things, and then it was his 2 sons, Titus and then Domitian. But persecution was a thing. Now, here's the thing: persecution is about maintaining a grip on power, and the idea is you eliminate the things that threaten you politically, and that's whether direct or indirect. And sometimes persecutions can also be used to be seen to be doing something, even if it doesn't actually solve it. So the people you target, if you come into power, and I need to make sure that I cement on power, and so what do I do is I persecute opponents. And so first on the list, immediate enemies, political rivals. You target the writers, because if they're critical of you, you want to make sure that their ideas do not spread. Okay. Now, like I said, this is not about highlighting or saying that this is a virtue. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This is showing how ruthless they were. And so writers were often singled out, especially if they were critical of the emperor. And that's something to remember for Revelation itself. But then you also go after things that can cast doubt on the legitimacy of your rule. And including in that is religious groups. And so, for example, Christians did experience persecution under Nero. Nero needed a scapegoat for the fires that happened in Rome. Whether Nero himself was responsible for those fires is a matter for historians to argue about. It's not part of the subjects here. But they were a convenient scapegoat because nobody really knew who they were. They were kind of mysterious, and the idea was that it made him seem to be doing something. And the thing is, when Domitian came to power in 81, he was reestablishing the imperial presence, the imperial culture, the imperial religious traditions of recognizing, and especially those that recognize the emperor, the emperor as being divine. And so it did raise the specter. Whether or not it actually happened is a matter of historical debate, but it did raise the possibility of another Nero-type persecution. Hence why we see at the end of chapter 13 this mention of 666 pointing at Nero, even though the emperor at the time was Domitian. And Christians were convenient targets because they were a mystery religion. People didn't really know a lot about them. They were associated with Jewish wars, but mostly it was a case of they were caught in the crossfire, but they were kind of perceived as potentially connected to this insurrectionist movement, even though those who were involved, especially the zealots, would have considered Christians as Roman collaborators. It wasn't a really good place to be. But because they like Judaism, they could not, in good conscience, acknowledge the emperor as divine. And so therefore, if you put someone on the spot and made them make some sort of sacrifice to a statue of the emperor, it could be an exercise in treason. And so they certainly they refused the Roman pantheon, but more specifically, not so much the Roman pantheon per se, but but seeing the Roman empires or the Roman emperor as being divine, as part of that. Curiously enough, because they didn't actually have an image of their god to worship, they were perceived as atheists. Interestingly enough. Oh yes, we were also cannibals. Did you know that? Strictly speaking, well, because here's my body, here's my blood. Go ahead and eat. That was an accusation that was flung at Christians, and some of it got really, really dark. That not only that we were cannibals, but baby eaters. And so that perception may well have been then, good targets. I need to be seen to be doing something. Well, we got to do something about these weird Christians. and so, but you see, by the end of the first century, around the time that Revelation was written, Judaism and Christianity had largely been moving in different directions for at least, at that point in time, at least 20 years. However, the Romans didn't care. They didn't know, they didn't care. So they were seen as, even though many early Christians were fully Roman citizens, and they had very little connections to Judaism, this was not clear in the minds of Roman authorities at all. And so, along with Jews were persecuted under Domitian, and probably Christians may, at least in some areas, may have also experienced that. Because it wouldn't be until Trajan, about roughly 20 years later, that began to perceive Christians as being different. Didn't necessarily let up on persecutions, but that distinction was not clear at the time that Revelation was being written. So Asia Minor, you already saw the map. And what is modern day Turkey is whenever I say Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, and largely the western edge of it, but really it extended across right into Armenia and to the edge of the Persian Empire, what we now see as Iran, the top of Syria, Iraq, that area, but was referred to as Asia Minor. But the one thing, Asia Minor was largely thanks to Paul, was fertile ground. Early Christianity flourished probably the most in this area. And around the Aegean Sea, but it certainly did flourish in terms of the overall population growth of people who identified as Christians. And of course, Domitian's actions would probably run into kind of run up against this in Asia Minor. So there are some references to direct references to persecutions or perceived persecutions underway. For example, John considered himself needing to be in exile. You know, whether he was under threat of life or limb, or that he just felt that he needed to remove himself from it. We do have the example of someone who is referred to as Antipas in Revelation chapter 2, who is mentioned as having been executed. Now, the trouble is, keep in mind, this is also symbolic language here. So Antipas may not have actually been the actual name of the individual. So just be careful about that. And so this was the external threat. But in addition to the external threat, there are a couple of other things in that are mentioned. There are this Nicolaitans, which truthfully, we're not entirely sure what that necessarily means. It's one of these references that it's a case of, if you don't play hockey, you may not know that the Senators are a hockey team. So not knowing how to play hockey when it comes to Revelation, we don't know what hockey team the Nicolaitans represent. You also have a potentially anti-Semitic line here, or things that have been used in an anti-Semitic way by later translators, talking about Jews and the synagogue of Satan. There's a context I'm going to try and address a little bit later that might shed a little bit of light on that. And then we have that woman Jezebel. Now, the thing is, clearly it is not an actual name of someone, because Jezebel, remember how I said that in Revelation, you have roughly 500-ish verses, and you have well over 700 references to the Old Testament. And so in this particular case, you have Jezebel, who is the wife of Ahab, which was the husband and wife rulers of Israel when Elijah was prophet. So in First Kings. And so here you have, and of course Jezebel, clearly it's definitely a metaphorical reference, placing a value perhaps on an individual, but that kind of thing, that again, layered symbolism with that name. But what that points out to is that in addition to the external threat of persecution, there was also an internal threat of identity. And there's more on this, that in fact, the greatest threat to Christianity was not Roman persecution at all. In fact, it was more of an internal with Christianity losing its identity amidst a sea of mystery religions. And there were those who saw no problem with that, were kind of pulling things all together to kind of create their own. So of these internal and external threats, we also had the ideas, the church the early Christians trying to understand who they were, what their own identity was. And in that, you had different movements that were kind of going their own way. Now, Marcion, who I talked about in the formation of the New Testament, wouldn't come along for another 20, 30 years, at least. But at the same time, there was the beginning movements of a movement within not just Christianity, but within several different religious traditions called Gnosticism. The idea basic idea is that the material world is bad, a spiritual world is good, and taken to the extremes, by definition, it's automatically dualistic, which flies in the face of the understanding of Christianity as monotheistic. Even though we use a Trinitarian formula, we still are a monotheistic tradition. Gnosticism, by its definition, isn't that. But it was very, very influential. It was kind of like, best way to describe it is kind of like it was almost like an infectious virus of ideas that threatened to overwhelm the core understandings of Christianity. And it was actually because of that threat that the creeds that we use, they were developed in response to that, of those internal threats. So let's go to the 7 letters. Now, here is an overall outline of this is the outline of Revelation as a whole. So, and I wanted to just set this, is that this is the categorization that Eugene Boring uses in his Revelation commentary. That is, like, he breaks it up into sort of 3 different groups, not even spaces at all. That you have God is speaking to the church in the city, and this is Boring's distinction. God judges the city, and then the redemption of the city beyond that. And so God speaking to the church in the city is really what we're dealing with today. And that's the 7 letters to the 7 churches, and that picks up effectively it picks up starting really in verse 9, beyond that introduction, where he introduces, he states the states for himself. That's where he mentions in verse 9, where he mentions Patmos, and then we get into the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Any questions in terms of that overall structure? So, all right. So here's a question. Why does John of Patmos start this off with letters that really aren't letters?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Because the thing is, if you actually look at it, the 7 letters to 7 churches aren't actual genuine letters, strictly speaking. A letter is, for example, you look at the correspondence that I had with my mother today. Mom sent me a message this morning saying that her furnace conked out and it's -22 in Calgary. And so for me, responding back to her, I'm responding directly to what she says to her. I'm not saying back anything. I'm not doing any flourishing language. I'm, are you all right? Are you keeping warm? That kind of thing. And so there's this direct correspondence back and forth. The letters of Paul that are letters are actually dealing specifically with that you actually have Paul answering questions from a previous letter that we can only guess the content of, because we don't have those. We just have what Paul is addressing. But by the time that Revelation was written, Paul's letters at that point in time, we know, were in circulation. They had been in circulation for roughly, at this point, 40 to 50 years, approximately. Probably closer to 30 to 40 years, but I mean, significant length of time, and at least enough for one full, if not 2 generations of early Christians. The writings of Paul were definitely in place, and one of the places that Paul operated out of was Ephesus. So you have that culture there, and so in this case, Revelation is an apocalyptic writing, but at this point in time, John breaks with how a lot of apocalyptic styles start, and uses this motif of letter writing, and that's a callback to Paul. And so the idea is there's also this thing that you're traveling along this route. Remember how I showed you that kind of arc that they're working their way through, and the church, what the letters do, they functionally work as a gathering together of the church of, come on, we're gonna take a trip, and we're going to all of these churches together, and we are going together. So it's this symbolic gathering of the church. So when how many of you had a chance to read the seven letters? Okay.
So you're
Yeah.
suggesting they weren't really letters?
I'm actually stating that outright. They weren't specific letters to individual churches, because they're not, what you don't have here is pieces of course, they're not pieces of separate correspondence that John pulled in and compiled. This was done more as, think of it as an encyclical.
As a what?
An encyclical. It's kind of like, think they're open, they're functionally they're open letters, but they're actually more like a psalm.
I was gonna say like a poem.
Yeah, they're quite poetic. So some of the similarities, like for example, they all form, they have a structure to them that works. Think of it this like it's like a hymn. That there is a certain structure, certain melodic structure to it. So for example, to the angel of the church in blank, and that's now notice I've skipped over all that imagery in chapter 1, and I'm diving straight into that. So we can go back and talk about some of the weird images in chapter 1, but that'll be more like a kind of a Q&A. But I want you to pay attention to the structure here. Is that to the angel of the church in Ephesus, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, to the angel of the church in Pergamum. It's phrased that way, and so we have that beginning structure each time. It's like these aren't individual letters that were once written and then pulled together. It is part of the rhythm and structure. David.
We go back to the beginning in chapter 1. The way the way I see it or written in the Bible is that okay, so John is he's an exile. He's exiled
Yes.
to this island, Patmos, and he has a vision. The vision is from God, but through Jesus, and then Jesus uses an angel to deliver the message to John.
Yep.
And then John is taking that thought or that process and delivering it to in his letters to the congregations, but with an I guess as he puts it, angel of the church in that congregation.
Yeah. And
that message. It's complicated.
Yeah, and keep in mind, like, this is all it's going to be dense, so it's going to break your brain, trying to think about it too much. Just keep in mind, it's supposed to be evocative. So, for example, like I'm not a sports guy at all, but you've heard the term team spirit, right?
Yes.
Okay. team spirit generally, doesn't mean that there is some sort of objective creature, ethereal creature floating over top of a given team. What it means is the sense of people's enthusiasm for cheering for this particular team. It's not a great metaphor, but it's kind of, think of it like that, like that. It is the overall ethos and people and frankly the team spirit of each of these churches. So I mean, that could be a way to understand. I'm not saying that's a definitive way. Nothing I'm saying here is ever going to be definitive. And so of course you have this image, like starting from in chapter 1 verse 12, and you have this this description of what we assume to be Jesus. I mean, like in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man. Gold, and then we have the golden sash. His hair was white like wool, white as snow. His eyes were like flames of fire. Feet burnished bronze. Each of these things has a symbolic meaning attached to it, being mashed together. His right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. And at that point, the image is losing. Okay, all of a sudden, my brain breaks to try and imagine, because that would be very difficult to talk with a sword hanging out of your mouth. But at the same time, that should also give you the ideas that of how symbolic the language actually is. And so then we have, I have the keys of death and Hades, which interestingly enough comes back a little bit later. Holding the seven stars, and then talking about the ethos of it. So anyway, let's get to this. To the angel of the church in phrase. These are the words of, and then it describes Jesus in some way, shape, or form, using metaphorical symbolic language to describe, really to describe Jesus. And then I know your works, or I know your affliction, or I know your living. So 5 of them are works, but it's this 7-fold repeated pattern of I know you in some way, shape, or form. Then in the body of the letter, there is usually an affirmation or and a correction. And then there's this refrain that I use every Sunday. Listen to what the Spirit is saying to the church. And then there is a promise to everyone who conquers, everyone who comes through this. And then there is a metaphor for, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but a metaphor for eternal life.
Yeah.
And this is the song rhythm of the 7 letters to the 7 churches.
And he promises something different to each one of those 7 churches. And yeah, he seems to recognize that each of these different areas are going through, some of them are not as religious as others, some are being persecuted more, some are being much more Satan-like. Yeah.
Well, but curiously enough, here's an example of layered symbols that in many respects they all do actually point to the same thing, but they're different ways of phrasing. So we are going to get, I actually bring that out specifically. So part of when doing something like this and looking at it is, it's important to look at what the similarities are, but also what differences are. So let's do the similarities first. Is that it's a musical symbolic way, like for example, speak to you in these are the words, like for example, Sardis. These are the words of him who has the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. It's already kind of established in the end of chapter 1. These are different ways of describing God in Christ. And then it identifies with the individual church. This is also a similarity. It addresses a situation, but keep in mind, these aren't individual letters that is closed mail that only the church in Sardis gets this, only the church in Laodicea gets this. It's open for everyone to hear. Let anyone who has an ear to listen what the Spirit is saying to the churches, plural. And that plural is definitely in the Greek. So it's intended for everyone is hearing everybody else's stuff. So it isn't just a case of the church in Laodicea is, okay, no, we're just going to wait till we hear what we need to hear. The intention is everybody needs to hear it all. But at the same time, the differences also are important, because here's like when you have this kind of repeated pattern, sometimes when you actually pay attention to the differences, then they get into a little bit more specifics of really in many respects 7 things that need to be paid attention to. And so it does seem to have some sort of addressing of an on-the-ground situation, but uses symbolic language to describe it. So as a result, it has both that layer of being something on the ground, but also an ongoing broader a broader meaning to it that can lift it away from its like where it can extend beyond its original historical context. And also each of them gets a different affirmation and correction. Curiously enough, there's some churches that only get an affirmation, and there's some churches that only get a correction as well. I'll get into what that means. And the thing is, they all seem to have this. The correction itself is this cosmic sounding consequence. If you don't do this, there's this cosmic consequence. But really, what it means is that if you don't correct this, you will cease to be the church. Ultimately, that's what that's what it's pointing to.
Mhm.
And so the differences, in fact, the repeated pattern draws you in, but the differences are the core message. And I mean that's one thing with, if you pay attention to what the differences are, that's where the message is necessarily brought out. So let's start with Ephesus, because we are going to do this in order. So we have for Ephesus, starting in chapter 2, to the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks amongst the 7 golden lampstands. Those images are already established in chapter 1. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance. I know that you cannot tolerate evildoers. You have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. I also know that you are enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name, and that you have not grown weary. So that's an affirmation. Not getting tired to their commitment. But the correction, on the other hand, is you've lost a bit of your enthusiasm. It's wearing you down. So remember from what you have fallen. Now, curiously enough, one of the biggest hangups that I have with Greek, specifically the Greek translation of the word repent. Repent in Greek, the word is metanoia. It means to change your mind, your notion, your way of thinking. Mm-hmm. Repent in English means to feel so guilty that you change your ways. Mm-hmm. There is no guilt in the word metanoia at all. And unfortunately, that's an English filter that we have to deal with. That every time you see the word repent, replace it with metanoia, change your mind or change your soul. I mean, but it's the idea is undergoing change, but it lifts, like, get that guilt out of there. Like just pull that guilt out. I don't know if Richard is smiling or not, but the guilt just is not in the word repent in the Greek word for repent at all. So be careful of that, please. And so because for some of us, it's been hammered into us that the guilt is what matters, and it's not. So we have the affirmation, we have the correction. And then we're going to jump ahead to Smyrna. So we're just going through the affirmation and corrections right now. So Smyrna encourages them in their suffering, both in poverty and the external, what they perceive to be external persecution. There is actually no correction, but more like a warning of saying, the devil's about to throw you into prison. In this case, it's a concern for people's well-being, that they may run afoul of the Roman authorities. It would be a time of trial. Curiously enough, in the phrase the Lord's Prayer that we translate as "and lead us not into temptation," modern ecumenical versions translate that as "save us from the time of trial." And that time of trial is that the time, save us from the time of trial of being effectively forced to make a sacrifice to the Roman Emperor. Pergamum. Well, here is the affirmation, encouraging them to live in resistance, even though they live in evil shadow, where Satan's throne is, as they described it. But one of the things that you may not know is that until roughly 130 years before this, Pergamum was the seat of Roman power in the area, and some of that authority, that perception would be continued, but also it was known to have, there was a great altar that were dedicated to many of the Olympian gods that would have been like the Greek pantheon that was converted to Roman imperial worship. So that's what that might be alluding to, at least in terms of some of the symbolism to it. But at the same time, how is it necessarily phrased? Where we have here. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and practice fornication. And so you have some of you who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Again, we're getting symbolic language there for things we don't necessarily have the direct references there. Balaam is a reference to a figure in the early Old Testament. That is not the person's name. And so it's pulling some of that metaphor forward. And then we have basically it's the worried about that, like here's some of the issues of Gnosticism. The Nicolaitans may be a metaphor for that. Like Gnosticism wasn't fully formed by then, but it was certainly starting to emerge. And so that's what the Nicolaitans may be in reference to. Um, so Thyatira is the affirmation, you're becoming mature in faith. Good on you. And on the other hand, we have the mention of Jezebel. Here we have probably what may be a more clear reference to early Gnostic thought, because sometimes it was referred to as the deeper things of God. And here we have this kind of this reversal on it. So just, kind of be careful about that. Jumping to Sardis. Now, interestingly enough, Sardis does not have an affirmation. I know your works, and then jumps immediately. I have, so where we have here. And to the angel of the church in Sardis, the words of him who is the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. I know your works. You have a name of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains and is on the point of death. For I've not found your works perfect in the sight of my God. Remember then what you received and heard, obey it, and change your ways. In other words, you're kind of complacent, you're apathetic. And perhaps because they're removed, they have a false sense of security. Philadelphia, okay, steadfast amidst not being well off, not feeling empowered, possibly in the face of what are referred to as Judaism, that word. I'm just I'm almost out of my drink here. I think I'm going to have to get another one because I'm losing my voice if I don't do that. So I'm going to finish this up and then run and get another one. Now, one of the things that the early church struggled with was, do you need to become Jewish in order to become Christian? You have to become Jewish first and then become Christian. There were many that thought, yes, that you actually had to do that. Now, Paul himself said, no, you don't have to do that. Because the one thing that people who, the ones who affirmed that one had to become Jewish first, meant that, especially if you were male, you needed the scissors, which may not have necessarily been appealing. But so you have have references in Paul and other places of mutilators of flesh. That's what they is the idea is that Paul fought for and said, look, people who are wanting to follow Christ do not need to become Jewish first, whereas some early Christians said, in fact, that you do. And there are these competing ideas were all across Asia Minor, and so this doesn't surprise. This shouldn't be surprising that in this case. So, but in this case, Philadelphia, in fact, it's an affirmation, and there is no correction. Well, you're doing okay. We're going to leave it at that. And then Laodicea, by contrast, there is no affirmation, and just says, you know what, you're too far away from you are too far away from what some of the other churches are struggling with. And if you've gotten complacent, you've actually, and in fact, that complacency is dangerous. Now, keep in mind, this is intended for the entire church. So this isn't just, okay, Laodicea is just going to close their ears off to everything else, even though there's certainly a temptation to do that, but wanting to make sure and move through that. So anyway, so these are the affirmations and the corrections. Then I'm going to get to the closing blessings, but I'm going to go get a drink before I lose my voice. So I will be right back. If you have any questions, conjure them up now and put up your hand, and I'll get to it when I come back. Hang on for a second. Right, I'm back. Oh. Sorry, my mouth was really starting to dry out there. Oh, okay. So one thing that's also consistent with the with all of the letters is all of them have a closing blessing. And the thing is, even if there is no affirmation in there, they all contain a promise, which is important. And so similarly, keep in mind, think of these like verses of Psalm. So seven verses of a psalm, and they all contain a promise, and every single one of them are promises that are metaphors for eternal life. So for example, in Ephesus, paradise of God, tree of life. So the to everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. In other words, when we did Genesis, one of the things about the exclusion from the Garden of Eden of being able to eat from the tree of life, that was effectively the prevention. When the man and the woman were exiled from the garden, they no longer had permission to eat from the tree of life. So that's pretty substantial. That's going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. Smyrna, the crown of life. Notice the theme. That to everyone who conquers, Smyrna is whoever conquers will not be harmed with whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. So here, be faithful until death. I will give you the crown of life. Effectively, and so Pergamum, heavenly food, manna. White stone, a new name. These again are all metaphors for eternal life. I mean, so, and it's one of the reasons why these are so. There's so much depth in Revelation that Revelations comes up with many different ways to say this, many different ways and many lyrical ways to say the same thing. Thyatira is invincible rule, the morning star. And where are we here? Yeah. To everyone, to everyone who conquers, I will give some of the. Sorry, that's Thyatira. Here we are. To everyone who conquers and continues to do my works to the end, I will give authority over the nations to rule them with an iron rod, as with Cleopods or shatters. To the one who conquers, I will also give the morning star. Again, these are all metaphors for eternal life, drawing from different places specifically in the Old Testament. White garments, book of life.
Sure.
Yeah. You will be clothed like them in white robes, and I will not blot your name out of the book of life. And then Philadelphia, a pillar in the temple of God. if you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God, and you will never go out of it. Again, eternal life. And then Laodicea, eating with Christ, the symbol of communion, also again a metaphor for eternal life. Just various different ways of doing that, but again, it's intended to be evocative, not specific. So these are very much open-ended symbols. So the idea is the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Keep in mind, 7 is also metaphorical. So 7 meaning heaven and earth combined. In other words, it's all together. It is the church as a whole, even though, like, you know, there were churches, there were churches over in Corinth across the water. There was a church in, you know, church in Thessalonica, again across the water. And Athens and other places, but specifically here, it's this kind of symbolically bringing the whole church along. Even though they're addressed specifically to the churches in Asia Minor, it is metaphorically as the whole church. And that the nice thing about that, specifically with these 7 letters to 7 churches, is that even now, you know, the 19 centuries later, that it's kind of like, yeah, you can come along too, because this has meaning for all of us. But again, as we talked about last week, 7 is, you know, the symbolic of the number 3 is symbolic of heaven. 4 is symbolic of earth combined together. 4 plus 3 is 7, and that sense of completeness. So it's the whole church. Hey, and what John is doing is gathering them all together and saying, okay, here's all these letters and words of encouragement, but like, keep in mind, this is just at the beginning of the book. So let's all go and look at this. And when we are going to go into this revelation together. So the one thing is, unfortunately, when we read scripture, we tend to things like pull things out sort of like individually. And we often fail to look at the greater whole. And what is happening here is that John of Patmos is trying to get us all together. This is a gathering. And the next time that we gather in 2 weeks, not only is he's gathering up the whole church, the first place that he stops is the divine throne room, which is a wonderful scene, but it's also hilarious in some different ways. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. But the idea is that they're intended to be universal appeal. They're dealing with what were the issues that the early church were facing. We're all facing it. We're all in this together. Let's go. Let's go look at this. Let's go see what God has in store. So that actually, like, we're just hitting 8:30, and so like that's where we're kind of going. Is the idea is that this is now at the end of verse 22 in chapter 3, that all the churches have had their letters, and then all of a sudden we go into and after this, I looked, and there in heaven stood a door open. In other words, I gathered you all together. Oh, look, a door. Let's go look and what's through the door. And so the idea is that we have this whole gathering. So as a follow-up, here's one thing that you can do. Again, all this stuff is optional, but you can do this. And I want you to just pick one of those letters and look at the affirmations and the correction portions of the letter. How might one of those apply to Trinity? And my suggestion is pick the letter first rather than the affirmation. So in other words, don't let the affirmation guide which one you pick. Just grab one and go with it. David.
You've actually, what you're saying now is what I wanted to ask you about in
Yeah.
terms of what John was identifying in those 7 cities.
Mm.
So though he apparently he did not write actual letters to them, but it sounds like he had a knowledge of each of those places,
Yes.
and so he personally felt he could identify attributes to those places.
Mhm.
Is that right? Or
Yeah, I mean, there is there needs to be, there is at least some in what he's written, there seems to be some degree of a knowledge on the ground, even though he's using metaphorical language to talk about it. I know your works, for example. And so what we have here is this this ongoing I know your works. But what he's also saying here is that that information, I know your work specifically in Laodicea, you know, I'm sort of looking at you, but at the same time, he's also trying, like having everybody else, okay, you may be looking at this, but this also applies to you as well. So yes, there's individual knowledge of individual situations on the ground there that does appear to be clear. But because he's using this symbolic language, he's trying to lift it out of that situation and also making it apply broadly.
Okay.
So
that leads me to the second part, was that he could have actually selected 7 other cities or 12 other cities or whatever. It just seemed to fit into the kind of message that he was trying to get across to everybody.
Yes. And so that's why I'm not saying which one of these letters applies to Trinity for this optional assignment. What I'm saying is each letter says can say something to Trinity. What is and what would it be? So in other words, unfortunately, I don't have a 7-sided dice to throw for you to roll. Oddly enough, if there were 12, I have a 12-sided dice. But the idea is to just like pick one at random and see, for this is an exercise for yourself, and you can send it to me sort of privately, of how might that apply to Trinity. But at the same time, it's, keep in mind, this is a gathering song. So there are 7 verses to this gathering song. So don't get too hung up on any one of this, but we are gathering together as the church, and hey, a door is open. Let's go through that door. And that's in 2 weeks, we get to go through that door.
Okay. So we're to pick Trinity, not Nanaimo. If anybody read that article from the bulletin.
Oh, in terms of Nanaimo being the least religious city.
Yes.
in least
In
religious
Canada.
The city in Canada. And
Yeah.
I would venture to say that keep in mind that when John of Patmos is writing this, the congregate, like, the trouble is we can't use the term congregate. We use the term congregation to describe churches because we tend to think in very individualistic terms. A congregation is a group of individuals. And that's largely thanks to the Enlightenment, that we do have perceptions of ourselves more as individuals than we do as a collective. And it's really hard to emphasize this, But prior to the Enlightenment, people generally didn't think in that way. There may have been some exceptional individuals, but they were always part of the community that they were part of. And it's something that's very difficult for us to get our head around. Hence, why the angel of the church is kind of think of it the spirit of the church. So and I mean, curiously enough, John is not identifying individual. Like, I mean, he names a few people using metaphorically what appears to be, but generally is largely talking in a broader, more symbolic way. So so you just kind of think of that. And I'm not looking for which one do you think of this applies to Trinity. It's kind of like no, just pick one and say, what of this could Trinity learn from? Could Trinity learn from, or even think of the church in your a church that you were part of in your youth, or when you were younger. How might that apply there? How might that apply there? But at the same time, so that might be a helpful exercise. But really, if you're wanting to think of it from the point of view of Trinity, here's one way to be able to think about it and work with. So anyway, next week is not next week. Next week is 2 weeks from 2 weeks from tonight. And specifically, I want you to look at seals, trumpets, and bowls. So this does require getting in and kind of getting into the weeds a little bit. And so I want you to pick one of the sets of symbols. So the first set of symbols is seals, and that's where we have here is that the seals happen largely between the chapter 6, really chapter 6 through 8, and then in chapter 8 the trumpets immediately follow on. But then to get to the bowls, you've actually got to jump all the way to, where are we here? The bowls, bowls pick up at, here we are. Oh, I should. Okay, and the bowls pick up in chapter 16. So you're looking at chapter 6 through 8, and then pick up in verse and then verse 16 through, or sorry, chapter 16 through through just chapter 16 alone. Yeah, just in chapter 16. So chapter 6 through 8, and then chapter 16. And what I want you to do is look for symbolic and numeric patterns in the text. But pick one of them, whether it's the seals, the trumpets, or the bowls. Just pick one. You don't have to do all of them. Just do one. But if you want to, compare bowl 1 to trumpet 1 to or seal 1 to trumpet 1 to bowl 1. Like pick one of them and then just go across and see if you can see any parallels. David,
why those particular? Because there's lots of symbols in there, not just those.
Oh yeah, well, specifically one of the reasons why I want you to focus on these is because the book is called Revelation. Revelation is about revealing. Apocalypse in Greek means to reveal, to pull back the curtain. Seals represent, and I'll cover this in 2 weeks. I'm kind of getting my, when you break a seal, you're opening something and you're revealing something. Trumpets announce something, or someone's about to walk in, trumpets announce, but they reveal someone coming. Bowls hold contents, and when you pour them out, you're revealing the contents of the bowl. They are all themselves ways of revealing, and because they become the vehicle behind which all the other symbols flow out of that. That's why I'm specifically doing that. You have, you know, these symbols of revealing.
Okay.
So I hope that makes sense. So, and so with that, that brings tonight to a close. Thank you for indulging me of going to get this, because I was losing my voice, and it's possible I may lose my voice by Sunday. So we will have to see. I'm kind of, we're still going ahead. We're doing the dedication of prayer shawls on Sunday. But with that, I'm going to just stop the recording.